The air smelled like wet pavement and lavender laundry detergent. I was kneeling on the floor of my closet, the door cracked just enough to let in a sliver of gray afternoon light. In my hands, I held a silk camisole that I'd buried under a stack of heavy winter coats. It wasn't mine, technically, but my fingers knew the texture better than they knew my own skin. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a mix of absolute terror and a strange, quiet rightness. I wasn't supposed to be this person. I was supposed to be the guy who lived in the main room, the one who drank black coffee and nodded at sports scores. But in the dark, holding that fabric, the exhaustion of being him felt heavy enough to crush me. Then, the front door slammed. The sound of the door was like a gunshot. I shoved the silk back into the darkness, piling the heavy wool coats over it like I was burying a body. By the time my roommate, Mark, called out my name, I was standing in the middle of the room, hands in my pockets, shoulders hunched in that specific way I'd learned made me look broader, safer. It's hard to explain the noise to someone who hasn't heard it. It wasn't a ringing in my ears, it was a static in my soul. Every morning, I woke up and felt the weight of the costume settle over me before I even opened my eyes. It was a physical sensation, like wearing a wool suit 3 sizes too small in the middle of July. I'd look in the bathroom mirror and see a stranger staring back. I'd spent years building him. I grew a beard not because I liked it, but because it felt like armor. It scratched against my hand, a constant, rough reminder of the lie. I pitched my voice lower, grinding it down into a gravelly register that hurt my throat by the end of the day. Socializing was the worst. I remember sitting in pubs with friends, watching myself from the ceiling. I'd hear myself laugh at jokes that weren't funny, see my hand lift a beer I didn't want. It was a performance, and I was a terrible actor who had somehow convinced the audience. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I'd say things like, "Man, that's crazy," or "Yeah, bro," and the words tasted like ash. The disconnect was so severe that sometimes I'd look at my hands and not recognize them as human. They were just tools used to maintain the facade. The only time the static stopped was when I was alone with the stash. It wasn't a lot. A few drugstore lipsticks, that silk camisole, a pair of leggings I'd bought online under a fake name. People talk about this stuff like it's a fetish, like it's some illicit thrill. It wasn't. It was oxygen. It was a survival kit. When the noise in my head got too loud, when the dissociation made me feel like I was dissolving into the air, I would touch those fabrics. I would put on the leggings and look at the shape of my legs and think, there I am. That's real. It was the only time I felt solid. The only time the world stopped spinning, but you can only hold your breath for so long before you drown. The cracks started small. I'd catch a glimpse of a woman walking down the street, just a normal woman, buying groceries or checking her phone, and I'd feel a jealousy so sharp it doubled me over. It wasn't that I wanted to date her. I wanted to be her. I wanted her mundane problems. I wanted her ponytail. I wanted the way the world looked at her and just accepted her existence without question. It came to a head on a Tuesday in November. It was raining again. I had just come back from a gym session I hated, trying to build muscles I didn't want, trying to force my body into a shape that felt even more wrong. The smell of old iron and stale sweat clung to me, a scent that was supposed to be validating, but felt like poison. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my gym clothes, the sweat cooling on my skin, and I realized I couldn't stand up. I physically couldn't make myself stand up and go shower and be him for one more evening. The static was a scream now. I looked at the closet door. I knew what was in there. I knew it was a risk. Mark was in the living room watching TV. The walls were thin. But the alternative was shattering completely. I locked the bedroom door. The click of the lock was the loudest sound in the world. The lock clicked, and the sound was a physical barrier between the world I performed for and the world I actually lived in. The silence in the room changed immediately. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a conspiratorial hush, like the room itself was holding its breath with me. The air felt thinner, cleaner, charged with a secret electricity. I moved to the closet, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a slow, deliberate reverence. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was the tremor of an addict reaching for the only thing that stopped the pain. Or maybe a starving person reaching for bread. I stripped off the gym clothes. The heavy, damp cotton hit the floor with a thud that felt satisfyingly final. I kicked them into the corner, away from the sacred space I was creating. Then, I reached into the back of the closet, past the winter coats, to the small plastic bin I kept hidden under a pile of old shoeboxes. I pulled out the skirt. It was a simple thing, a soft, pleated midi skirt in a dark floral print. I'd bought it at a thrift store 3 towns over, terrified the cashier would ask who it was for, but she hadn't even looked up. Stepping into it felt like stepping into a warm bath. The fabric was cool against my legs, swishing softly as I pulled it up. It settled on my waist. My actual waist. Not where men wear their pants low on the hips. I exhaled, a long, shuddering breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Then came the blouse. It was cream-colored, with small pearl buttons. My fingers were clumsy as I fastened them, my knuckles rough and large against the delicate plastic. But as the fabric draped over my shoulders, something impossible happened. The tension that lived permanently in my neck and shoulders, the hunch I adopted to hide my height, just evaporated. I stood there for a moment, looking at my feet, afraid to look up. The floorboards were familiar. The rug was familiar. But the shadow I cast on them was different. It was softer, curvier. Then, I looked at the mirror. I didn't see a man in a dress. That's what the world tells you you'll see. That's what the fear tells you. It tells you you'll look ridiculous, a caricature, a joke. But I didn't see a joke. I saw me. For the first time in years, the person in the glass looked like the person in my head. It was disorienting, like seeing a ghost that turned out to be alive. The beard was still there, the broad shoulders were still there, but the context had shifted. The softness of the blouse, the way the skirt flared, it didn't cancel out the masculinity. It somehow made it irrelevant. I saw my eyes. They weren't dead anymore. They were wide, terrified, and unmistakably bright. I remember touching my face. My reflection touched her face. It was a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity. I thought, oh, there you are. I thought you were dead. It felt quiet. That's the only word for it. The static was gone. The screaming in my brain that told me I was a fraud, a liar, a freak. It just stopped. In its place was a hum, a low, steady vibration of rightness. It felt like when a key finally turns in a rusted lock. It felt like coming home to a house you didn't know you owned. I stood there for an hour. I just watched myself breathe. I watched how my chest rose and fell under the silk. I practiced walking, just a few steps back and forth in the tiny space between the bed and the dresser. I let my hips move the way they wanted to. not the stiff, blocked way I forced them to move outside. It felt fluid. It felt like water flowing downhill, taking the path of least resistance, but time is cruel in the closet. I heard the front door open again. Mark was back. The spell shattered. The panic returned, cold and sharp. I had to take it off. Taking off the skirt felt like peeling off my own skin. It physically hurt, a deep ache in the center of my chest. As I unbuttoned the blouse, I felt the grayness rushing back in. I put the gym clothes back on, cold, clammy, smelling of the old lie. I packed the skirt and blouse away, burying them deep. When I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway, the world was heavy again. The color had drained out of everything. I was back in the costume, but now I knew it was a costume. And once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. The silence of the room stayed with me, a secret hum under the noise, promising that she was still there, waiting in the dark for the next stolen moment. I just had to survive until then. Living with a secret like that changes the physics of your home. The apartment wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a minefield. I started tracking Mark's schedule with the obsession of a stalker. I needed to know exactly when he left for work, exactly when his gym class ended, exactly how long it took him to drive home in rush hour traffic. Every key turning in the front lock sent a jolt of adrenaline through me that tasted like copper. I became an expert in the sounds of the building, the specific heavy thud of his boots in the hallway versus the lighter step of the neighbor from 3B. I was living like a spy in my own life, constantly scrubbing my browser history, burying the clothes deeper in the closet, checking the lock on my bedroom door 3 times before I could sleep. It wasn't just the fear of eviction or an argument. It was the terror of the look. I knew exactly the look he would give me. Confusion, then disgust, then a pity that would be worse than hate. It almost happened on a Thursday. We were just sitting on the couch, eating takeout, the TV flickering with some mindless comedy. A character on the screen made a joke, a lazy, cruel punchline about a man in a dress. The laugh track roared. Mark laughed too. It wasn't a malicious laugh, really. It was casual. It was the easy, unthinking laughter of someone who has never had to question the shape of their own soul. "Man," he said, shaking his head. "Can you imagine?" He looked at me. He expected me to laugh. He expected the co-conspirator, the guy he drank beers with, the guy who nodded at sports scores. The silence stretched. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My throat closed up. I had 2 choices: defend a stranger and out myself, or laugh and betray myself. I laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound that scraped against my vocal cords. "Yeah," I said. Crazy. That word tasted like poison. I felt a physical wave of nausea roll through me. He turned back to the TV, satisfied, unaware that the person sitting next to him was bleeding out internally. That was the moment the armor became a cage. I realized the lie wasn't protecting me from the world. It was protecting the world from me. And it was suffocating me. The static returned, louder than before. It wasn't just noise now, it was a physical pressure, like being at the bottom of the ocean. I started having panic attacks in the bathroom at work, clutching the cold porcelain of the sink until my knuckles turned white, trying to remember how to breathe. The double life wasn't sustainable. You can't be 2 people. Eventually, one of them has to die. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if I kept feeding the man everyone expected, the woman inside was going to starve to death. I was mourning a person who was still alive, grieving a life I hadn't allowed myself to live. Then I saw her. It wasn't in a magazine or a movie. It was at the grocery store, in the produce aisle of all places. She was tall, taller than me. She had broad shoulders. Her hairline wasn't perfect. She was wearing a simple denim jacket and a skirt, and she was picking out apples. She was trans. It was obvious. In the way that family recognizes family. I froze by the bananas. I waited for someone to yell at her. I waited for the world to end. I waited for the sky to fall, but nobody cared. A mom with a stroller squeezed past her and said, "Excuse me." The cashier scanned her apples. The sun kept shining through the front windows. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't apologizing. She was just buying fruit. I watched her walk out to the parking lot, her keys jingling in her hand, the sunlight catching the curve of her cheek. She looked peaceful. Not ecstatic, not performing, just at peace. I went home and sat on my floor in the dark. I couldn't pretend anymore that it was impossible. I had seen proof that oxygen existed outside the tank. The impossibility wasn't the world, it was my fear. The pain of staying the same had finally eclipsed the pain of changing. I couldn't live another day as a ghost. I needed to be real. I needed to tell someone. I scrolled through my contacts. My thumb hovered over names. Mark? No. My parents? God, no. Then I stopped on Sarah. We'd been friends since college. She was the only person who had ever told me I had gentle eyes. It was a tiny thread, but it was the only one I had. I hit the call button before I could think about the consequences. The ringing sound was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Sarah picked up on the third ring. Her voice was warm, normal, completely unaware that I was holding a grenade that was about to blow up our friendship. I asked if I could come over. I said it was important. She didn't ask questions, just said the kettle was on. The walk to her apartment is a blur in my memory. I remember the sensation of the pavement under my boots, hard, unforgiving. I remember the wind biting at my face, making my eyes water. But mostly, I remember the terror. It wasn't the sharp, adrenaline-spiked panic of almost getting caught by Mark. This was a heavy, suffocating dread. It felt like I was walking to my own execution. My throat felt like it was filled with cement. My hands were shaking so badly I had to jam them into my pockets to keep from looking like I was going into shock. The air felt thin, insufficient, like I had to fight for every molecule of oxygen. When I got there, she was sitting on her velvet sofa, a mug of tea in her hands. The room smelled like vanilla and old books, a smell that usually calmed me but today made me feel nauseous. I sat on the opposite chair. I couldn't sit next to her. I felt contagious. I felt like if I touched her, I would infect her with my confusion, my mess. We talked about nothing for 10 minutes. Work, the weather, a movie she'd seen. I watched her mouth move, watched her eyes crinkle when she laughed, and I thought, this is the last time she looks at me like this. This is the last time I am just her friend, the guy she knows. I was grieving the relationship while it was still happening. Then the silence stretched. She put her mug down. She looked at me, really looked at me, with those gentle eyes. "You're shaking," she said softly. "What's wrong? Are you in trouble?" I tried to speak, but the words stuck. It physically hurt to push them out. It felt like vomiting. It felt like tearing open a stitch. I looked at the rug. I looked at a loose thread on the hem of her curtains. I couldn't look at her. "I can't be him anymore," I whispered. The voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like a child's.
Who? She asked.
The guy you think I am. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't empty. It was full of the things I hadn't said yet. I took a breath that rattled in my chest. I know I'm a woman. I think I've always been. I waited for the explosion. I waited for her to laugh, to tell me to get out, to call me sick. I braced myself for the rejection that I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. But the explosion didn't come. Okay, she said. It was so quiet. Just a simple exhale of a word. I looked up. She wasn't looking at me with disgust. She looked confused, yes. Her brow was furrowed, like she was trying to solve a difficult math problem. She looked sad, maybe. But she was still there. She hadn't moved. Okay, she said again, testing the weight of it. That makes a lot of sense, actually. It does? I choked out. You've always been you, she said, struggling for the vocabulary. You've never been like the other guys. You've always been softer, sadder. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. Do you have a name? A real one? I hadn't said it aloud to anyone. I had only whispered it to the mirror in the dark. It felt dangerous to bring it into the light, like it might dissolve if the air touched it. Lilly, I said. The word felt fragile, made of glass. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a pity smile. It was a greeting. Lilly, she repeated. Hearing it in her voice, in a voice that wasn't inside my own head, changed the molecular structure of the room. It didn't sound like a secret anymore. It sounded like a fact. It sounded luminous, like she had just lit a candle in a pitch-black room. The name hung in the air between us, shimmering. It's nice to meet you, Lilly, she said. And then she did the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me. She reached across the gap between the chair and the sofa and took my hand. Her palm was warm. My hand was ice cold, trembling, large and rough. But she didn't flinch. She held on. I started to cry. Not the polite, silent crying I'd mastered over the years. This was ugly, heaving sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the years I'd lost. I cried for the exhaustion. I cried because for the first time in my life, someone was holding my hand and knowing exactly who they were holding. That afternoon didn't fix everything. I still had to walk back out into the cold. I still had to go back to the apartment with Mark. I still had a beard and a deep voice and a body that felt wrong. But something fundamental had shifted. The secret had a witness. The truth had a shape. And if Sarah could look at me and see Lilly, then maybe, just maybe, Lilly was real enough to exist in the daylight. The terror was still there, but the loneliness had cracked. And through that crack, a sliver of light was finally getting in. It was enough light to see the next step. I knew I couldn't just change my clothes anymore. I needed to change my chemistry. The clinic didn't look like a cathedral. It was a beige building sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a sub shop, fluorescent lit and smelling of antiseptic. But for me, walking through those automatic doors felt like crossing a spiritual threshold. I sat in the waiting room, my leg bouncing with a nervous rhythm, clutching a clipboard that asked for my history. When the doctor called my name, Lilly, it wasn't a question. She didn't look at me like a curiosity or a science experiment. She looked at me like a clinician, solving a simple misalignment. She wrote the prescription with a casual flick of her wrist, unaware that she was signing a permission slip for my existence. Picking it up felt illicit. The pharmacy bag was white, crisp, and unassuming, but I held it against my chest like it contained a beating heart. Back in the safety of my car, I popped the orange cap. Inside were the pills. Small, oval, a pale, chalky blue. Estradiol. They looked like candy. They looked like nothing. It seemed impossible that something so small, so mundane, could rewrite the code of my entire history. I didn't wait to get home. I dry swallowed the first one right there in the parking lot, watching rain streak the windshield. I sat there for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, half expecting the sky to change color or my beard to instantly fall off. Nothing happened. The traffic kept moving. The world didn't stop. But inside, a timer had started. I had just introduced a new narrator to my bloodstream. The first change wasn't physical. It was the silence. About 3 weeks in, I woke up and realized the static was gone. That low-level hum of anxiety, the background radiation of wrongness that I had lived with since I was 12, had just evaporated. My brain felt quiet, clean. It was like I had been trying to tune into a radio station through heavy interference for my entire life, and suddenly, the dial clicked into place. The signal was clear. For the first time, I wasn't fighting my own biochemistry. It was like I had been driving a car with the parking brake on for a decade, and someone finally reached down and released it. I could just be. I could sit in a chair and exist without feeling the need to apologize for taking up space. The chemical static that had defined my internal landscape was replaced by a smooth, silent hum. Then came the feelings. Before, my emotions had been compressed, accessible only through a heavy filter of detachment. Now, the filter was gone. I cried because I dropped a piece of toast. I cried because the light hit a tree in a way that looked beautiful. It was overwhelming, messy, and exhausting, but it was also vibrant. I felt like I was seeing the world in high definition after a lifetime of sepia tone. The physical changes were slower, agonizingly slow. I became a cartographer of my own body, mapping every millimeter of change in the mirror every morning. Was my skin softer, or was I imagining it? Then, one day, I brushed my hand against my chest and winced. It was a sharp, tender ache behind the nipple. It hurt, but it was a good hurt. It was the pain of growth. It was the body finally answering the mind's request. My skin began to thin, losing that rough, oily texture of testosterone and becoming something drier, softer, more translucent. The smell of me changed. I no longer smelled like musk and sweat. I smelled sweeter, lighter. It's a strange thing, second puberty. You are an adult with a job and bills, navigating the world with the hormonal volatility of a teenager. My body was doing heavy construction work while I was trying to answer emails. But every time I looked in the mirror, the stranger was fading. The sharp angles of my jaw seemed to soften, not just from fat redistribution, but from a lack of tension. I wasn't clenching my teeth against the world anymore. The Lilly I had kept locked in the dark was beginning to bleed through the surface of the man everyone knew. She was cellular now. She was in my blood. And a woman who exists in the blood cannot be kept indoors forever. The mirror in Sarah's bedroom was different from the one in my closet. It was large, framed in gold, and bathed in the unforgiving, honest light of a Saturday morning. This time, there was no rushing. There was no listening for footsteps in the hallway or frantically scrubbing off lipstick with rough toilet paper. This was a ceremony, deliberate and slow. Sarah sat me down on a stool, her face focused, treating my skin not like a canvas to be painted over, but like a restoration project to be revealed. "We're going for grocery store casual," she said, her voice steady, anchoring me. "You're not a drag queen performing for a back row. You're just a girl getting coffee." She applied the mascara, her hand resting gently on my cheek to steady it. That touch, casual, platonic, feminine, felt grounding. I was wearing a pair of high-waisted jeans that actually fit my hips and a soft, oversized knit sweater that hid the width of my shoulders while suggesting a softness underneath. It was armor, but it was soft armor. When she spun me around to face the glass, I didn't see a disguise. I saw the version of me that had been waiting in the static. She looked terrified, yes, but she also looked undeniable. "Ready?" Sarah asked. "No," I said. "Let's go." The front door was the hardest part. Inside the apartment, the rules were ours. Outside, the rules belonged to a world that hadn't agreed to this change. My hand hovered over the brass knob. I felt a physical wave of nausea, a primal instinct screaming that I was about to step off a cliff. But I turned the handle. The air hit me first. It was crisp, smelling of autumn leaves and exhaust fumes. It felt shocking against my face, a face that was wearing foundation and mascara in the daylight. I instinctively hunched my shoulders, trying to shrink, but Sarah nudged me with her elbow. "Head up," she whispered. "You belong here." I stepped onto the sidewalk. This is where the spotlight effect hits you like a physical blow. In my head, I was a neon sign. I was a parade. I was convinced that every single person on that busy street, the jogger, the woman walking her dog, the couple arguing on the corner, would stop, point, and scream. I braced myself for the laughter. I braced myself for the confrontation. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the traffic, but the jogger ran past without looking up. The woman with the dog was trying to untangle the leash. The couple was too busy with their own drama to notice the tall girl in the sweater trying not to hyperventilate. Nobody cared. It was the most humbling, beautiful realization of my life. To the world, I wasn't a headline or a political statement. I was just background noise. I was just another extra in the movie of their lives. The sheer indifference of the city was a warm blanket. I wasn't invisible, but I was unnotable. I was just part of the scenery. We walked 3 blocks to the coffee shop. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, trembling with every step, but I kept moving. The sensory details of the world seemed hyper-real. The crunch of dry leaves, the flash of a red car, the smell of roasting beans drifting from the open door of the cafe. "You order," Sarah said when we got in line. This was the final boss. The voice. The pills change your skin, your fat, your emotions, but they don't touch the vocal cords. I had been practicing in my car, trying to lift the resonance from my chest to my head, but fear tightens the throat. Fear drops the pitch. I stepped up to the counter. The barista was a young guy with piercings, looking bored, tapping a pen against the register. He didn't look up immediately. "Hi," I said. My voice shook, hovering somewhere in the androgynous middle, fragile and thin. "Can I get a medium oat milk latte?" He looked up. His eyes scanned my face for a microsecond. I held my breath, waiting for the confusion, the double take, the hesitation. "Sure," he said, punching it in. "Name?" "Lilly," I said. He didn't blink. He didn't scowl. He just wrote Lilly on the cup with a black Sharpie. "That'll be $5.50. I paid. I stood by the pickup counter. When he called out, "Lilly!" 2 minutes later, I walked up and took the cup. The ceramic was warm in my hands. It was just a cup of coffee. It was the most mundane thing in the world. And yet, as I brought it to my lips, tasting the foam, I felt a euphoria that was almost dizzying. I had done it. I had existed in the world, and the world hadn't ended. We sat by the window for an hour. I watched people walk by, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost haunting the scene. I was in the scene. I was drinking coffee. I was a girl in a sweater talking to her friend. But adrenaline is a borrowed energy. You have to pay it back. As we walked home, the high began to fade, replaced by a crushing, heavy exhaustion. The euphoria of the first time is dangerous because it makes you think the war is over. But as I wiped the makeup off that night, watching the gray return to my complexion, I realized the truth. The barista hadn't clocked me, or maybe he was just polite. Sarah was safe. But I couldn't live in that coffee shop forever. I had to go to work on Monday. I had to see my parents. I had to navigate a world that wouldn't always be this indifferent. The first outing was a victory, absolutely. But it was just the opening move in a game I was going to be playing for the rest of my life. And the world was about to start playing back. The high of that Saturday didn't just fade. It was murdered by Monday morning. If the weekend was a Technicolor movie, Monday was a grainy, black and white documentary about a prisoner. I had to put the man costume back on for work. I was out to HR, but the timeline for the rest of the office was still pending. Pulling on my slacks and button-down shirt over a body that was chemically softening felt like wrapping myself in sandpaper. The fabric that used to just be boring now felt abrasive, wrong, a violation of the skin underneath. The office air smelled of stale coffee and ozone. I walked to my cubicle, head down, trying to make myself small, but testosterone had given me a frame that refused to shrink. The real violence happened in the 10 a.m. strategy meeting. I was sitting there, taking notes, trying to focus on quarterly projections, when my manager, Dave, pointed a laser pointer at the screen. "We need someone to aggressive tackle this account," he said, scanning the room. His eyes landed on me. "Let's put on it. He's a bulldog. He's the man for the job." The words hit me like physical projectiles. He, bulldog, man. It wasn't just an annoyance, it was a somatic shock. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under my chair. The static, which had been so quiet for weeks, came roaring back with the force of a jet engine. It was a disorientation so severe, I actually grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. It felt like gaslighting. I had spent the last 48 hours knowing, feeling, and seeing Lilly. I knew she was real. But Dave's voice was so confident, so casual in its assessment of my reality, that for a terrifying second, I wondered if I was the crazy one. Maybe the weekend was the delusion. Maybe this gray, fluorescent-lit room where I was a bulldog was the only truth. I nodded. I said, "Sure, Dave." My voice dropped an octave, a reflexive defense mechanism that made me want to vomit. I spent the rest of the meeting dissociating, watching my hand write notes that didn't belong to me. The drive home was a spiral. The doubt is the most dangerous part of the transition. It whispers to you in the safety of your own car. "Is this worth it?" it asked. "Was it really that bad before?" Sure, you were numb, but you weren't terrified. You weren't a raw nerve exposed to salt. You could just stop taking the pills. You could cut your hair. You could go back to being the guy who nods at sports scores. It would be so much easier. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't told her yet. I answered, desperate for a connection, but the conversation just twisted the knife. She talked about looking at old photo albums. "I was looking at your prom pictures," she said, her voice thick with a nostalgia that felt suffocating. "You were such a handsome boy. You looked so strong. She was mourning me. She was eulogizing a person who was still holding the phone. She was in love with a mask I had constructed to survive. Every compliment she paid to the old me felt like she was shoveling dirt onto the grave of the new me. I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen, the silence pressing in on my eardrums. I went to the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. I stared at the little orange bottle of blue pills. It would be so easy to flush them. It would be so easy to surrender. The world was pushing back with the weight of gravity, demanding I return to the shape it had assigned me. But then I looked in the mirror. I looked past the stubble that was growing back, past the masculine shirt I was still wearing. I looked at the eyes. They were red-rimmed and exhausted, but they were there. They weren't dead shark eyes anymore. I realized something in that cold, tile-floored bathroom. The pain I was feeling, the sting of the meeting, the ache of my mother's words was sharp. It was hot. It was agonizing. But it was alive. The numbness of the old life hadn't hurt because there was nobody home to feel it. I was hurting now because I was finally present enough to be injured. I shook 2 pills out of the bottle. I swallowed them with tap water. It was an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war against the path of least resistance. The world could push back all it wanted, but I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a woman with a headache and a heartache, and I would rather be a woman in pain than a man who didn't exist. The doubt didn't vanish, but the resolve hardened around it. I wasn't going back to the graveyard. I was going to live, even if I had to fight for every inch of ground. Time has a way of smoothing out the jagged edges of a revolution until it just looks like a landscape. 6 months later, the event of being Lilly stopped being a daily headline in my mind and settled into the quiet, rhythmic prose of a Tuesday afternoon. The adrenaline of that first coffee shop outing and the crushing, visceral despair of the boardroom misgendering both leveled out into a steady hum of existence. I remember waking up one morning, stretching my legs under the duvet, and realizing I hadn't thought about my gender for 3 hours. I was just thinking about the rain against the window and the email I needed to send. That mundane, boring silence was the most radical victory of all. The performance was finally over. I wasn't the actor on the stage anymore, sweating under the hot lights, trying to remember the lines of a man I never was. I was just in the audience, watching life happen, actually participating in it without the delay of a translation filter. The armor I had worn for so long, the beard that felt like wire wool, the low voice that scraped my throat, the hunched shoulders protecting a hollow chest, had rusted and fallen away. In its place was something softer, yes, but infinitely stronger because it was real. The daily ritual of taking my pills became as natural as brushing my teeth, a quiet, holy act of communion with myself. The true, luminous moment didn't happen on a podium or in a therapist's office. It happened on a Friday night at Sarah's apartment, amidst the smell of garlic bread and cheap wine. It wasn't just us anymore. We had gathered a tribe, misfits, transplants, people who had to build their own families from the scrap metal of their histories. There was Alex, a trans guy with a laugh that shook the room, and Maya, who had just started her own journey and looked at the world with wide, hungry eyes. We were sitting on the floor, eating takeout from paper cartons, arguing passionately about bad movies. I looked around the room and felt a sensation I had never experienced in the, quote, old life. I was completely fluid. I wasn't checking my posture to ensure it wasn't too feminine. I wasn't monitoring the pitch of my laugh. I was just laughing. I was sitting with my legs tucked under me, a piece of pizza in one hand, listening to Alex talk. In the old life, a moment like this would have been drained by the processor in my brain running the "don't get caught" software. Now, The processor was off. The bandwidth was free. I could smell the food. I could feel the warmth of the radiator. I was actually there. The air in the room felt thick with safety, a tangible weight that held us all together. I looked at Maya across the circle. She caught my eye and smiled. It was a look of recognition. Not the terrified recognition I had with my reflection in the dark closet, but a shared, conspiratorial understanding. We were the people who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, smelling of smoke, but holding our own names. I realized then that the lie I had lived for years hadn't been a cocoon protecting a butterfly. That's too gentle a metaphor. It had been a tomb. I hadn't been waiting to hatch. I had been waiting to be resurrected. And sitting there, surrounded by people who saw me, not the bulldog, not the handsome boy, but Lilly. I knew I was finally alive. The grief for the lost years was still there, sitting quietly in the corner. But it was no longer the guest of honor. Joy was. Later that night, before I left, I stopped in the hallway mirror. The same mirror where I had once stood trembling, terrified of the lipstick on my face. This time, I just glanced at it. I checked my teeth for spinach. I fixed a stray hair. I didn't look for the person inside. I didn't have to search for her through layers of static and fear. She was right there, on the surface, holding her car keys, ready to go home. The door to the street opened easily this time. The air outside was cold, smelling of rain and possibilities. But I didn't zip my jacket up to my chin to hide. I walked into the night, just another woman on her way home, the static finally replaced by the sound of my own footsteps. If you hear that noise in your own head, don't be afraid to listen. If you want to see what happens next, subscribe and join the story. This will help us continue to create content that is helpful and supportive for the community.